Okay, this is part two of the lecture on ceramics. When we last left off, we were talking about the influence of Chinese ceramics on Japan and the importance of Japanese ceramics in the history of 20th century art. Like I said, Japanese ceramics has a lot of this love of what you might call the happy accident of sort of an informality of process and letting things happen, of naturalness. And you can see that especially in 20th century ceramics, 20th century Japanese ceramics. And what we're looking at here is mostly the works of a pretty famous Japanese ceramicist, Ogata Kenzan. But we're also looking at a piece by Bernard Leach over on the far right. He was a British ceramicist who came to Japan. He came to Japan actually to, I think his original desire was to study Japanese painting. He was very much interested in Japanese culture, but he went to a tea party, and at the tea party he fell in love with the idea of ceramics, the importance of ceramics in the culture, and it was shortly after that that he started studying under Ogata Kenzan, and then the two of them came to the West for a while, and then Bernard Leach really brought the idea, the aesthetics of Japanese ceramics into Western culture, and that's probably one of the most important influences on 20th century ceramics. And then I guess probably the second most important thing in terms of 20th century ceramics was the development of the idea of an academic ceramicist, someone who is a university professor who teaches ceramics as an art form, as in part of an art department, and that these people, especially some of these greats right here like Paul Saldner and Peter Voulkos, were also very much influenced by the abstract expressionist work that was going on during their lifetime. And so they really tried to take ceramics into a new direction, a more expressive and more abstract but more sculptural direction. But they both also came out of a tradition of making vessels. As you can see, I included for both of them some vessel work, and that was an important part of their tradition and the way they thought about ceramics. But you know, the thing about sculptural ceramics is that it's always been there, right? That sculptural ceramics just didn't pop up in the 20th century. We see sculptural ceramics for the entire history of ceramics, such as in pre-Columbian art, like this Colima piece, a little dog, kind of like a chihuahua, or this laughing figure. I've seen this piece, this laughing figure piece from the Veracruz culture. That's actually at the St. Louis Art Museum. It's one of my favorite pieces they have in their museum. But all through this we can see, or including also these the terracotta soldiers from that Qin Dynasty burial. So we can see that people have been making sculptural works with ceramics for the entire history of ceramics. The last thing I want to talk about before we move on to talking about shape is I want to talk about Greek ceramics a little bit more. We ended off when we were talking about the end of the Axial Age, and we talked about the Mycenaean culture and the Minoan culture, and just very briefly talked about the development of Greek ceramics. And when we last left off, I think we talked about the forms that were called. We had like the period called the geometric period, and then the Orientalizing period. So there's this kind of transition from the geometric period where we see these very large vessels, and they're decorated in mostly these very kind of abstract repeating patterns like Greek key designs and other kinds of very geometric designs, and where the figures are just these very, very tiny, almost abstract, mostly made out of triangles and lines type figures. And then that transitions into this period where we have a lot of animal forms, and like the name indicates, Orientalizing period means that the influence was coming from the East, primarily from the Persian Empire. And this led to work later called the black figure work, where the Greeks were now using their ceramic vessels as a means of telling stories, to tell the Greek mythology. In this case, this is straight out of the Iliad, right? Achilles and Ajax right before the final battle for Troy, they, instead of getting doing things to prepare for battle, they choose to relax and throw die, to gamble, which in a way is a metaphor for the act of going to war in the first place. It's you're gambling with your life. So, and black figure was an important part of, and it's a beautiful form, but I also want to talk about, well, just very briefly, and I'll go back to the different types of vessels. I want to talk about this transition from black figure to red figure, which I think is incredibly important. And I don't want you to take the wrong idea, which is that even though it's a very important transition, I'm not trying to say that red figure is inherently better than black figure, just that it shows a really new way of thinking about shape. But before we get there, let's just talk a little bit about some of the different kinds of forms that the Greeks made. Greeks loved ceramics, and you can tell that in part because they had a name for almost every kind of vessel that they made. You won't have to know many of them. The one that you absolutely have to know is an amphora, in part because you're going to have to make your own version of an amphora. They made a couple of different types of amphoras. Probably the most famous are the Panathenaic amphoras, which were made primarily as gifts or as prizes for athletic contests. So these are less vessels for holding things and more as prizes. So oftentimes when people won, like Olympic Games or any kind of athletic games, like the Panathenaic Games, they would win an amphora. They also made vessels like Hydria, which is this one right here, or a crater. You can see those a lot at various museums. My favorite of all of these is this one right here, called the Kylix. I'll tell a little brief story about that. A Kylix is a drinking vessel, like it's a wine bowl, and you're supposed to hold it in both hands when you drink, and it holds a remarkably large amount of wine for one person to consume. But one of the fun things about Kylix is that in general they're highly decorated, but not just on the outside, also in the inside. They would usually make some sort of kind of bizarre looking image, like a giant eye looking at you, or a head of a Medusa, something kind of surreal, maybe a little bit scary, a little bit surprising, that would be in the bottom of the bowl. And the idea is that when you finish that large bowl of wine and you're a little bit tipsy after having drunk that much, and then you look down, you have kind of a little bit of a whoa, that's crazy kind of reaction to the bottom of the Kylix. So this is really the end of the lecture on ceramics, but once again I just want to say the importance of this transition. And here's the main thing I want to point out, which is that when the Greeks, and this is an example, here's a prize amphora, right? So it's an amphora you won for an athletic contest, and it's beautiful. And you'll notice that at the late black figure, they really pared down, simplified it, removed as much decoration as possible, keeping it just to like a few areas, and then they treat a large portion of it as this open canvas where it's plain red, and then the figures are painted black on that red ground, the red being the color of the ceramics itself, right? So anywhere that's red is actually is the color of the red clay, and anywhere is black is the glaze. The glaze, though, in this case is actually a type of slip. So, and it's beautiful, and the way it works is that the painters would paint the figures in black, and then they would come back and scratch away all the line work. And it is, it's a very stylish and it's very nice, but it is very much where the painter is painting the positive thing with a positive mark. They're putting down the shapes of the runners by painting them with their slip first. But look and think about the way someone would have to paint when they painted red figure. In red figure, they don't paint the figures. Instead, they paint the negative space behind the figures. So they have to plan out where they're going, how the painting is going to work, and then everywhere there is not a thing, they paint it black, and everywhere there is a thing, they leave it the light color of the red clay. Then they come back in with a very fine brush and draw in all the line work and the details. And so this leads to a complete flip in the way artists think about shape.